What is this?
Please, I'm sorry. I just needed this job to take care of my family.
A struggling waitress, a sick brother, and a debt that threatened to tear their lives apart. She thought she was invisible. Just another faceless girl in $1 million city. But a man in the shadows was watching. He saw her dignity when others saw only a servant. And with a single, impossible gesture, he offered her a choice that would change everything. A choice between her old life and a future she never dared to dream of. Was it a gift, a test, or a debt from a past she knew nothing about? This is the story of how a $20 steak and a $5,000 tip became a matter of life and death, unraveling a decades-old secret that would rewrite the story of a powerful dynasty. The Starlight Diner wasn't some idyllic, celestial haven. It was a greasy spoon diner situated off the I-95 corridor, a place where the Formica tables perpetually clung to a sticky residue, and the aroma of fried onions lingered in the air like a persistent, unwelcome ghost. For Chloe, it was simultaneously her prison and her sanctuary, a place of both confinement and solace. At 24, her aspirations of becoming a graphic designer, of transforming abstract concepts into vibrant, visually stunning realities, were as faded as the red vinyl clinging precariously to the booth seats. Those bright dreams had been brutally supplanted by the stark, unforgiving realities of overdue rent, mounting utility bills, and the crushing financial weight of her younger brother Leo's exorbitant medical expenses. Leo was her entire world. At 16, he should have been preoccupied with high school examinations, nervous first dates, and the usual anxieties of adolescence. Instead, his life was a relentless cycle of doctor's appointments, invasive blood tests, and grueling treatments for a rare autoimmune disorder that baffled even the most seasoned medical specialists and instilled a profound, gut-wrenching terror in Chloe's heart. The experimental therapies that offered him a fighting chance, a sliver of hope against the encroaching darkness of his illness, weren't covered by any standard insurance plan. So Chloe worked. She worked double shifts, exhausting herself physically and emotionally. She picked up holiday shifts. She covered for hungover colleagues. She did whatever it took to keep afloat. The constant ache in her feet, a dull, throbbing reminder of her tireless efforts, became a familiar companion, a physical manifestation of the deeper ache that resided within her heart. Tonight was a particularly grueling Tuesday. Rain lashed relentlessly against the diner's large plate glass windows, mirroring the tempestuous emotions brewing within its walls. The diner was a grim tableau of grumpy travelers and weary truckers, their exhaustion palpable. Her manager, a perpetually sour man named Mr. Peterson, had been relentlessly riding her all evening, his voice a grating, incessant soundtrack to her already stressful shift. "Bennett, table 4 needs a refill." "Bennett, that order has been sitting under the heat lamp for 2 minutes." "Bennett, smile. You look like you're at a funeral." I might as well be, she thought grimly, forcing a semblance of a smile onto her face as she approached a family of 4, her emotions a turbulent sea beneath a carefully constructed facade of calm professionalism. She moved through the chaotic environment with a practiced, almost robotic grace, an automaton skillfully navigating a maze of spilled milkshakes, forgotten orders, and simmering impatience. Yet, beneath this meticulously crafted exterior of efficiency, Chloe remained acutely aware of the world around her, a quiet observer in the midst of the swirling chaos. She noticed the elderly woman in a booth meticulously folding her napkin, her solitude acutely apparent. She observed the young couple in the back, their hushed, angry tones betraying their simmering conflict. And she continued to notice the man in the corner booth. He had been there for nearly 2 hours, nursing a single cup of black coffee, his presence a quiet anomaly in the diner's typically boisterous atmosphere. He was unlike any of the usual clientele. He was dressed simply, a dark gray Henley shirt and jeans, but the fabric was clearly of superior quality, a stark contrast to the polyester and worn denim of the other patrons. He wasn't engrossed in a newspaper or scrolling through his phone. He simply observed. His gaze wasn't predatory or intrusive, but rather quiet, observant, deeply analytical. He possessed intense, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the entire room without so much as a flicker of movement. Chloe estimated him to be in his late 30s, the subtle network of lines around his eyes suggesting stress rather than simply the passage of time. There was an unsettling stillness about him, a quiet intensity that permeated the space around him, drawing her attention involuntarily. Around 9 o'clock, the bell above the door jangled violently, announcing the arrival of a man who seemed to carry his own personal storm cloud with him. He was loud, ostentatious, dressed in an expensive but garish suit, reeking of cologne and an overweening sense of entitlement. He snapped his fingers to get Chloe's attention, a gesture that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. "Hey, sweetheart," he barked. "Steak, medium rare, and a beer. Make it quick." He didn't even bother to look at her, his gaze glued to his phone as he impatiently tapped away. Chloe quickly scribbled down his order. "What kind of beer?" she asked. "Whatever's domestic and cold. Don't make me think," he snapped. She retreated to the kitchen, her jaw clenched tight with a mixture of frustration and suppressed anger. She delivered the beer and promptly put in the steak order. 20 minutes later, she placed the perfectly cooked steak in front of him. He cut into it immediately, took a single bite, and then threw his fork down with a clatter that silenced half the diner. "What is this garbage?" he boomed. "I said medium rare. This is shoe leather. Are you deaf or just incompetent?" Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. Mr. Peterson's head shot up from his office, his eyes wide with alarm. All eyes in the diner were suddenly fixed on her, a spotlight of intense scrutiny illuminating her sudden discomfort. The old Chloe, the one before Leo's illness, might have responded with a sharp, witty retort, but the current Chloe, the one whose job was the sole lifeline keeping her brother alive, swallowed her pride, the bitter taste of humiliation briefly overtaking her resolve. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll have the kitchen make you another one right away." "Don't bother," he sneered, pushing the plate away. "I've lost my appetite. I'm not paying for this slop." "Sir, you've eaten a quarter of it," she pointed out softly, her voice calm and measured. "Are you arguing with me?" His voice escalated, rising in both volume and pitch. "You want me to tell your manager what a useless waitress you are? I'm not paying. Get me the check for the beer." Mr. Peterson was already scurrying over, his face a mask of panicked apology. "Sir, my apologies. Of course, the steak is on the house. Is there anything else we can get you?" He shot a venomous glare at Chloe. "I'll be speaking with you later, Bennett." A hot flush of shame crept up Chloe's neck. She mumbled a barely audible apology and quickly walked away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She busied herself wiping down a counter, her back to the room, desperately trying to regain her composure. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. After the man paid for his beer and left, Chloe began clearing his table, her movements stiff and mechanical. As she picked up the plate, she noticed something tucked underneath it. A $20 bill. It was more than enough to cover the steak he'd refused to pay for. She looked around, but the man was gone. It must have been an accident, she thought, a momentary lapse in his blatant disregard for her well-being. She took the money directly to Mr. Peterson. "Sir, the man at table 7 who just left. This covers the steak." Peterson snatched the bill from her hand. "Good. Means I don't have to dock it from your pay," he grumbled, stuffing it into the register without another word. Defeated, Chloe resumed her duties. The night wore on. Finally, the diner began to empty, the sounds of clattering dishes and hurried footsteps gradually fading into a relative quiet. The only person left besides Chloe was the quiet man in the corner. She approached his table, coffee pot in hand. "More coffee, sir?" He looked up, and for the first time, his gaze was fully focused on her. His eyes were a startling shade of green, like moss after a rain. "No, thank you. Just the check, please." His voice was calm and deep, a stark contrast to the grating belligerence of the steak-eating man. She fetched the small slip of paper. $2.50. She placed it on his table. He laid a credit card on the tray, a simple, black metallic card with no gaudy design. The name on it read, Ken O'Connell. She ran the card and brought back the receipt for him to sign. He neatly scrolled his signature, added a tip, and folded the receipt over before placing it back on the tray. "Have a good night," he said, his eyes meeting hers again. There was an unreadable expression in them, something akin to empathy or perhaps respect. "You too, sir," she replied automatically. He stood, revealing that he was taller than she'd initially thought, perhaps 6'2", with a lean, athletic build. He gave a slight nod and walked out into the rainy night, leaving the diner in an unsettling silence. Chloe picked up the tray. Her mind was already calculating. A 20% tip on $2.50 would be 50 cents. Maybe he'd be generous and leave $1. She needed every penny. She flipped over the receipt, her breath catching in her throat. She stared, certain her exhausted eyes were playing tricks on her. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. The bill was $2.50. On the tip line, he had written, clear as day, $5,000. Below the tip, in the same neat, strong handwriting, was a short message. Character is a currency that isn't accepted everywhere. Where it matters, it's priceless. Your patience tonight was worth more than this. Below that, a phone number and another line. If you believe you're worth more than this diner, call me. We have something to discuss. Chloe sank back into the booth, the receipt clutched tightly in her hand, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. $5,000. It was more than 2 months' rent. It was a full cycle of Leo's medication. It was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the otherwise relentless darkness of her financial struggles. But it was the note that truly left her reeling, its message far more profound and weighty than the sheer magnitude of the financial windfall. He had seen everything. He had witnessed her humiliation, her restraint, her quiet dignity, and he had placed a value on it that was beyond comprehension. The world, which had felt so small and gray just minutes before, suddenly felt vast, terrifying, and impossibly full of light. The Starlight Diner closed at midnight. Chloe spent the last hour in a daze, mechanically wiping down tables and restocking salt shakers. Mr. Peterson, mollified by not having to comp the steak, granted her a good night and left her to lock up. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she pulled the receipt out of her apron pocket. $5,000. The number still didn't feel real. It was a typo. It had to be. No one tips $5,000 on a cup of coffee. He must have meant to write $5, and his pen slipped, but the decimal point was precise. The zeros were perfectly formed. And then there was the note. She sank onto a stool, the smell of bleach and old grease filling her senses, a stark contrast to the surreal piece of paper in her hand. The money was one thing, a shocking, life-altering thing. But the message felt heavier, more significant. Your patience tonight was worth more than this. Someone had witnessed her lowest moment of the day, the apex of her humiliation, and seen value, not pity. Value. Her first instinct was a tidal wave of suspicion. This was a joke, a cruel, elaborate prank, or worse, some kind of scam. The phone number was probably a premium rate line that would charge her a fortune. The credit card would bounce in the morning, and Mr. Peterson would deduct the $5,000 from her wages for the rest of her life. She pictured herself 30 years old, still working at the Starlight, endlessly paying off this phantom tip. But the card had felt heavy. Real. Ken O'Connell. The name was unfamiliar, but it sounded substantial. She pulled out her own cracked smartphone and with trembling fingers typed the name into the search bar. The results hit her like a physical blow. The first few links were to business journals. Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. The headlines were dizzying. Ken O'Connell, the reclusive tech maverick behind O'Connell Industries. O'Connell's ethereal AI poised to revolutionize logistics. From orphan to oracle, the unlikely rise of Ken O'Connell. Photographs showed the same man from the diner, though usually in impeccably tailored suits instead of a Henley. The same intense green eyes, the same quiet, assessing expression. He was the founder and CEO of O'Connell Industries, a multi-billion-dollar technology and investment firm. He was notoriously private, rarely giving interviews or appearing at public events. One article described him as a ghost in the machine of modern capitalism, a brilliant mind who valued anonymity above all else. Another detailed his tragic backstory. His parents, Irish immigrants, had died in a car accident when he was a teenager, leaving him to be raised in the foster care system. He had built his empire from nothing. Chloe felt the air leave her lungs. The man who had sat in her section for 2 hours, watching the dregs of society drift in and out, was one of the wealthiest men in the country. He had seen her get verbally assaulted over a $10 steak. She slumped against the counter, her head spinning. Why? Why would a man like that be in the Starlight Diner? Why would he care about a waitress? And why would he leave a tip that was, to her, a fortune, but to him, probably less than a rounding error? The phone number on the receipt now seemed like the most intimidating thing she had ever seen. What could he possibly want to discuss? Her mind raced through a dozen scenarios, each more outlandish than the last. Was this some bizarre recruitment test for a TV show? Was he a philanthropist looking for a sob story to feature in a campaign? Or was it something darker, something transactional? She couldn't even bear to imagine. She walked home in the rain, the thin fabric of her jacket doing little to keep out the chill. The receipt was tucked safely in her wallet, feeling like a hot coal against her hip. Her apartment building smelled of damp carpet and boiled cabbage. Inside her small, cluttered living room, she checked on Leo. He was asleep, his breathing shallow. But even the latest round of medication sat on his bedside table, a vial of liquid gold that cost more per ounce than any perfume. Looking at him, the fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce, desperate resolve. The $5,000, if it was real, was a godsend. It would cover next month's treatment completely. It would mean she wouldn't have to choose between keeping the lights on and buying the medicine that kept her brother alive. The risk of calling the number, whatever it was, suddenly seemed very small compared to the risk of not calling. The next morning, her bank app confirmed it. The credit card transaction had cleared. The diner's account was 5,002 50s richer. Mr. Peterson, seeing the deposit, was in a state of flustered disbelief. He assumed it was a corporate expense account error and said nothing to Chloe, terrified that acknowledging it would make it disappear. For Chloe, the reality of the money was a dizzying relief. She could breathe, but the number remained. All day, during another grueling shift, it preyed on her mind. If you believe you're worth more than this diner, call me. Did she? Before Leo's illness, she had been a promising student at the community college, her graphic design portfolio brimming with talent and passion. She had believed in her future. But years of exhaustion and worry had eroded that belief, grinding it down to mere survival. Did she still believe she was worth more? Yes. The answer came from a deep, almost forgotten part of herself. Yes, she did. That evening, after making sure Leo had eaten and taken his medication, she sat on her lumpy sofa, the piece of paper in her hand. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. It rang twice. A crisp, professional voice answered, "O'Connell Industries. How may I direct your call?" It was a woman's voice, cool and efficient. Chloe's mouth went dry. Hello? My name is Chloe Bennett. I was given this number by Mr. O'Connell." It came out as a question. There was a brief pause. Chloe could hear the faint, almost imperceptible click of a keyboard. "One moment, Miss Bennett." She was put on hold. The music wasn't the usual tinny elevator tune. It was a complex, beautiful piece of classical piano. It only made her feel more out of place. After what felt like an eternity, the woman's voice returned. "Mr. O'Connell can see you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. The address is 1400 West Bridge Avenue, Penthouse Suite. Please bring a form of identification. A car will be waiting for you at your address at 9:15. Does that work for you, Miss Bennett?" Chloe blinked. A car? A penthouse suite? This was actually happening. "Yes," she squeaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, that works." "Very good. We will see you then." The line went dead. Chloe stared at her phone. 1400 West Bridge Avenue was the O'Connell Tower, a gleaming spire of black glass and steel that dominated the city skyline. It was a monument to a world she had only ever seen from the outside, a world of power, of wealth, of influence. Tomorrow, she was going to walk into the heart of it. The fear was immense, a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. But beneath the fear, a tiny, fragile spark of something else ignited. Hope. The next morning, Chloe woke up before her alarm. She spent an hour agonizing over what to wear. Everything she owned seemed to scream, "Struggling waitress." Her jeans were faded, her blouses were from thrift stores, her one good dress was for weddings and funerals. She finally settled on a pair of simple black trousers, a plain white blouse that was thankfully not see-through, and a gray cardigan to hide the frayed cuffs. She pulled her hair back into a sleek, low ponytail, trying to look professional and invisible at the same time. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a silent black sedan pulled up in front of her rundown apartment building. The car was so clean and polished it seemed to repel the grime of the neighborhood. A driver in a crisp suit got out and opened the back door for her. "Bennett?" "Yes," she mumbled, sliding onto the plush leather seat. The interior of the car smelled of wealth, a subtly clean scent, that was the polar opposite of her daily life. The drive was silent and smooth. As they drew closer to the city center, the O'Connell Tower loomed larger, a shard of obsidian piercing the sky. Chloe felt like a peasant being summoned to the king's castle. They bypassed the main entrance, pulling into a private underground garage. The driver escorted her to a private elevator. He used a key card, and the elevator shot upwards with a silent, gut-wrenching velocity. There were no buttons for other floors. It was a direct flight to the top. The doors opened not into a lobby, but directly into the penthouse suite. And it wasn't an office. It was a sprawling, minimalist space that seemed to be floating in the clouds. The walls were almost entirely glass, offering a staggering 360-degree view of the city below. Chloe could see the highway, a ribbon of concrete, where the Starlight Diner sat like a forgotten toy. The furniture was sparse and elegant. Low-slung sofas, a single abstract sculpture, and shelves filled with books, not awards. The air was cool and still. A woman with a severe haircut and an impeccably tailored suit approached her. She was the one from the phone. "Miss Bennett, I'm Genevieve Ashford, Mr. O'Connell's Chief Operating Officer. He will be with you shortly. Can I get you some water or coffee?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes were cold and appraising, sweeping over Chloe's outfit in a way that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Water would be fine, thank you," Chloe said, her voice small. Genevieve Ashford nodded curtly and retreated. Chloe stood awkwardly in the center of the vast room, terrified to touch anything. This single room was larger than her entire apartment. The view was a panorama of power, and from this height, all the struggles and noise of the street below were rendered insignificant and silent. It was the world as seen by a god, not a man. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" The voice came from her right. Cian O'Connell emerged from a doorway she hadn't noticed, which presumably led to the actual offices. He was dressed in a simple dark gray suit that fit him perfectly. He looked more powerful here, more at home, but his eyes held the same quiet intensity. "I mean," he clarified, walking towards her, "sometimes I think it's a dangerous thing. Puts too much distance between you and the world." He gestured for her to sit on one of the sofas. She perched on the edge, her back ramrod straight. He sat opposite her, not behind a desk, but in a matching armchair, creating an atmosphere that was more conversation than interrogation. "Miss Bennett, Chloe, thank you for coming," he began. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." "A few," she understated, her hands clenched in her lap. The tip? I don't understand." "It wasn't a tip," he said simply. "It was a down payment, an investment. I spent 2 hours in that diner. I do it once a year on the anniversary of my parents' first date. They met there. It's a way to stay connected to where I started. Most of the time, it's a depressing experience. I watch people treat the staff like they're invisible, like they're not human. I watch the staff become hardened and cynical in response. It's an ecosystem of casual cruelty." He leaned forward slightly, his green eyes fixed on her. "But I didn't see that in you. I saw the rudest customer I've witnessed in years treat you like dirt. I saw your manager throw you under the bus, and you handled it with a quiet, steely dignity that most people in my boardroom lack. You took a moment, you composed yourself, and you got back to work. You didn't let his ugliness become your own. That's rare. It's a strength." Chloe was speechless. He was dissecting her character with the precision of a surgeon. And then he continued. "The homeless man who came in just before I left. Frank, he comes in every Tuesday. Your manager was about to throw him out, but you intervened. You gave him that unclaimed slice of pie and a cup of coffee, and you put it on your own tab. I saw you mark it in your notepad." Chloe's face flushed. She'd completely forgotten about that. It was such an automatic gesture, a small act in a long line of them. She never thought anyone would notice. "So no," Keon said, leaning back. "This isn't about a tip. I don't believe in charity, Chloe. Charity creates dependence. I believe in investment. I invest in businesses, in technology, in ideas, and most importantly, I invest in people. People with integrity, with resilience, with character." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "Your brother's name is Leo. He has a stage 3 variant of Kawasaki disease, complicated by macrophage activation syndrome. The current treatment protocol involves high-dose IVIG and an experimental TNF inhibitor, which costs roughly $22,000 for a 6-month course, not including consultations and hospital fees." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. How do you know that?" "I have extensive research resources, Miss Bennett," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, not threatening. "When I consider an investment, I do my due diligence. Your life is difficult. You dropped out of a graphic design program where you were at the top of your class to care for him. You work 70 hours a week. You have no safety net." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "So this is my proposal. It's not a gift, it's an offer. As of this morning, Chloe's world spun, a sob catching in her throat. The crushing weight of Leo's medical debt, a constant companion in her waking hours, was lifted. Tears welled, tears of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Khan had paid it all, establishing a fund to cover all future medical expenses. He called it a signing bonus. "But that's not the offer," Khan said, turning back to her. "That just clears the board. I'm starting a new philanthropic branch of my company, the O'Connell Foundation. It's not about writing checks. It's about creating tangible, on-the-ground support systems for families in crisis, people who fall through the cracks. I need someone to build it from the ground up, someone who understands what it's like to be in those cracks, someone with empathy. I also need someone to create the entire visual identity for the foundation, the logos, the website, the campaign materials, someone with a talent for graphic design." He looked directly at Atudher. "I'm offering you a job, Chloe, Director of Community Outreach and Brand Development for the O'Connell Foundation. The starting salary is $120,000 a year with full benefits. You'll report directly to me. Your first task will be to use your own story, anonymously, of course, to design a program that helps people exactly like you." Chloe stared, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and a terrifying, exhilarating hope. From waitress to director in a single conversation? Impossible. A dream. "Why?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why me? You could hire anyone." Can O'Connell offered a small, sad smile. "Because the best people to solve a problem are the ones who've lived it. I can hire 100 Ivy League graduates with MBAs. They can create spreadsheets and projections. They can't create genuine connection. They don't know what it feels like to choose between medicine and electricity. You do. Your perspective isn't a liability, Chloe. It's your greatest asset. The question is, are you ready to use it?" From the corner of her eye, Chloe saw Genevieve Ashford in the doorway, her expression a mask of stony disapproval. In that instant, Chloe understood this wasn't just a job offer. It was a test. A plunge into the deep end of a world she didn't comprehend. A world where some, like the woman in the doorway, would be waiting for her to fail. Accepting Khan. O'Connell's offer was the easiest and most terrifying decision of Chloe's life. The word yes tumbled out before she could process the seismic shift it would create. One moment she was drowning, the next she was gasping on the shore, bewildered by her escape. The first week was a blur of paperwork and bewildering orientation meetings. She was given a spacious, sterile office on the 48th floor, just 2 below Can's penthouse. Her window offered a view only slightly less magnificent than his. She had a state-of-the-art computer with every design program she'd ever dreamed of using, a corporate credit card, and an assistant, a polite, nervous young man named Peter, who seemed terrified of her. The most profound change, however, was quiet and intensely personal. The first night after her meeting with Khan, she went home and told Leo. She explained as best she could that a wealthy benefactor had noticed her at the diner and offered her a job, and as part of the package, all his medical bills were covered, forever. Leo, accustomed to the quiet anxiety that permeated their lives, simply stared at her. Then, for the first time in years, he broke down and cried. Not tears of pain or fear, but of pure, unadulterated relief. Chloe held him, the two of them weeping together on their lumpy sofa, the crushing weight that had defined their existence finally, blessedly gone. That single moment was worth more than any salary or fancy office, but the relief of her personal life stood in stark contrast to the mounting pressure of her professional one. The O'Connell Tower was a world unto itself, with its own language, its own customs, and its own unforgiving hierarchy. It was a gilded cage, and Chloe felt like a common sparrow trapped inside with a flock of calculating predatory hawks. The undisputed matriarch of that flock was Genevieve Ashford. From day one, Genevieve made her disdain for Chloe abundantly clear. It wasn't overt aggression, but 1,000 subtle, insidious cuts. She would forget to include Chloe in crucial email chains. She would schedule vital meetings and accidentally send the invitation to Chloe's old, defunct HR email address. In group settings, she would introduce Chloe with a slight, almost imperceptible emphasis. And this is Chloe Bennett, who is heading up our new foundation. Khan has a personal interest in this project. The implication was clear and venomous. Chloe was a pet project, a charity case, not a colleague. Chloe tried to ignore it, focusing on her work. She threw herself into designing the foundation's visual identity. Ideas dormant for so long came flooding back. She sketched logos, designed website mock-ups, and created branding guides. The work was exhilarating. When lost in a color palette or typography choice, she could almost forget the cold stares and whispered conversations that followed her down the hallway. Her first major assignment was to develop and present a proposal for the Foundation's inaugural project. Drawing on her own experience, she designed the Bridge program, a system to provide immediate, no-questions-asked financial relief to families facing sudden medical or housing crises, buying them the crucial 30 to 60 days they needed to find a more permanent solution. It was about filling the gap, the terrifying chasm between a paycheck and catastrophe. She worked tirelessly on the presentation, creating compelling infographics and a detailed, compassionate plan. The presentation was to be made to the company's executive board, a panel of 6 sharp, suited, stern-faced individuals, including Genevieve and Khan. Chloe felt sick with nerves as she stood at the front of the boardroom. The room was intimidating, all dark wood and polished chrome, with a view that could make a person feel dizzy. Khan gave her a small, encouraging nod from his seat at the head of the table. Genevieve, seated to his right, looked bored. Chloe began, her voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining strength as she spoke about the people she wanted to help. She talked about the paralyzing fear of an eviction notice, the shame of having a prescription declined at the pharmacy counter. She didn't use her own story, but she poured all her own emotions into it. When she finished, there was a polite silence. "A very passionate presentation, Ms. Bennett," commented Mr. Davies, a board member, his tone non-committal. Then Genevieve spoke, her voice smooth as glass. "Indeed, passionate. However, I see a few practical and, frankly, alarming oversights." She picked up the proposal Chloe had distributed. "Your projected budget for this bridge program is ambitious, to say the least. But more importantly, your vetting process for applicants seems dangerously lax. Minimal paperwork, you say? Emphasis on speed. That sounds like a recipe for fraud. How do we ensure we're not just handing out money to grifters and sob stories?" Chloe was prepared for this. "The goal is to eliminate the bureaucratic barriers that often prevent the most desperate from getting help. We'd have a small team of caseworkers to do rapid personal follow-ups. The initial grant is small enough to be a low risk for the foundation, but large enough to be life-changing for the recipient. It's about trusting people first." Genevieve gave a small, condescending laugh. "Trust. A lovely sentiment, but a disastrous business model. We are a corporation, Ms. Bennett, not a soup kitchen. Every dollar must be accountable. Your proposal lacks metrics for success, key performance indicators, and a scalable framework for fraud prevention. It's emotionally driven, not data-driven." She had reframed Chloe's strength, her empathy, as a fatal weakness. The other board members began to murmur in agreement, their faces hardening. Chloe felt her confidence crumble. Genevieve was speaking their language, the cold, hard language of profit and loss, of risk mitigation and scalability. Chloe's compassionate plan suddenly sounded naive and childish. She fumbled for a response, but the corporate jargon Genevieve had deployed was like a wall she couldn't climb. She glanced at Khan, hoping for support, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. Watching her, letting her handle it. It was a test, and she was failing spectacularly. The meeting ended with the board tabling her proposal for further review. A polite term for killing it. Chloe walked back to her office, her face burning with humiliation. She felt like an imposter who had finally been exposed. Genevieve had been right all along. She didn't belong here. The final, most cruel cut came 2 days later. Peter, her assistant, knocked on her door, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Miss Bennett, I thought you should see this." He handed her a printout of an internal memo drafted by Genevieve. It was a proposal for the Foundation's first major fundraising event, a lavish high society gala. The theme was A Gilded Evening of Giving, and it targeted the city's wealthiest donors. The memo proposed an Adopt a Family program where donors could be matched with a vetted, deserving, needy family, complete with a glossy brochure of their story. It was a perversion of everything Chloe had intended. It turned charity into a spectator sport for the rich, turning families' private tragedies into sentimental commodities to be purchased. It was everything she had fought against. And at the bottom of the memo, in the section for Project Lead, was her name. Genevieve hadn't only rejected her idea, she had twisted it into this grotesque parody and assigned Chloe to execute it. It was checkmate. If she refused, she would look uncooperative and incapable. If she accepted, she would be forced to betray her own core principles. Chloe stared at the memo, the words blurring through a fresh wave of tears. She had been so wrong. Can O'Connell hadn't saved her. He had simply moved her from one cage to another, this one more luxurious, with a far more cunning serpent inside. She picked up her bag, leaving the memo on the desk. She walked past her bewildered assistant, got in the elevator, and rode it down to the ground floor, not knowing if she would ever come back. Chloe didn't go home. The thought of facing Leo's hopeful face was more than she could bear. Instead, she walked. She walked for hours, letting the city's anonymous crowds swallow her up. The towering buildings that had once seemed to promise a new future now felt oppressive, their glass and steel facades reflecting her own failure back at her. She found herself almost unconsciously in her old neighborhood. The familiar sights and sounds, the rumble of the elevated train, the smell of street vendor hot dogs, the chatter of people on their stoops were a painful reminder of the life she thought she had escaped. It was a hard life, but it was honest. There were no hidden agendas, no corporate sabotage. Cruelty like that of the man in the diner was at least direct. This new world, with its smiling assassins and polite poison, was infinitely more treacherous. She ended up on a bench in a small, scruffy park, watching children play on a rusty swing set. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Khan. She ignored it. It buzzed again and again. On the 5th call, she finally answered, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "What? Where are you?" His voice wasn't angry, just calm and direct. "Does it matter? I'm quitting. You can tell Genevieve she won. I'm not cut out for your world." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to find you." Before she could protest, he hung up. A part of her wanted to run, to disappear completely, but exhaustion, both physical and emotional, kept her rooted to the bench. 20 minutes later, the same black sedan she had first ridden in pulled up beside the park. Khan got out of the back seat. He wasn't wearing a suit, but jeans and a dark pullover, looking more like the man from the diner than the billionaire CEO. He walked over and sat on the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. He didn't speak for a long time, just sat with her, watching the kids play. The silence was more comforting than any platitude would have been. "I know about Genevieve's memo," he finally said, his voice quiet. "I know what she did in the boardroom. I let it happen." Chloe flinched as if struck. "You let it happen? Was it all just some sick game to see if the charity case could swim with the sharks?" "No," he said, turning to look at her. His face was serious, all traces of corporate polish gone. "It was a test, but not just for you. For the board, for the system I've built. I wanted to see if they could recognize genuine value over polished presentation. They failed. And I needed you to see the battle you were truly signing up for. It's not just about helping people, Chloe. It's about fighting the apathy and cynicism of the very systems that are supposed to help." "I can't fight that," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't know how. I don't belong in that boardroom. I don't speak that language." "You don't have to," he insisted. "You just have to speak your own. But you're right. I haven't been entirely honest with you. I asked too much of you without giving you the whole truth." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "The reason I was at that diner. It's true my parents met there, but there's more to it. And the reason I chose you. It wasn't random. It wasn't just your character." In that moment, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a folded, yellowed piece of newspaper, carefully laminated. He handed it to her. The headline read, "Off-duty paramedic, a hero in highway pileup." The date was 16 years ago. The article described a multi-car crash on I-95. An off-duty paramedic on his way home had been the first on the scene. He had pulled a woman from a burning car just seconds before it was engulfed in flames, saving her life. The article named the hero paramedic. His name was Daniel Bennett. Chloe stared at the name. Her father's name. He was a paramedic. He had died when she was 8, a month after this article was published. A sudden, massive heart attack in his sleep. Her memories of him were fragmented, blurry images of a kind man with a warm smile who was always tired. "The woman he saved," Khan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "That was my mother." Chloe looked up from the clipping, her heart stopping. She stared into Khan O'Connell's green eyes, and for the first time she saw not a billionaire or a CEO, but the boy who had almost lost his mother in a fire. He saved her life, Khan continued. My father was in the car behind her, trapped. He saw the whole thing. Your father was fearless. After the ambulance took my mom to the hospital, your father just faded back into the crowd. My dad tried to find him to thank him, but he couldn't get his name at the scene. By the time we tracked him down through the paramedic service a few weeks later, we learned he had passed away. We never got to thank him. We never got to repay the debt. He looked away toward the skyline that bore his name. My parents died 2 years later in another crash. I went into the foster system. I never forgot the name, though. Daniel Bennett. For years, I've had my people searching, trying to find his family to see if they needed anything. The search was difficult. You and your mother moved after he died, and your mother remarried and changed her name. It was only recently, through a deep-dive public records search, that we found a match. A Chloe Bennett, daughter of the late Daniel Bennett, living in the same city whose younger brother had a catastrophic medical diagnosis. He turned back to her, his eyes pleading for understanding. When I saw your name, I had to see for myself. I came to the diner to watch you. I thought I would just anonymously pay off your debts and disappear. But then I saw you. I saw him in you, that same quiet strength, that same instinct to help without seeking reward, that dignity. It wasn't charity, Chloe. It was never charity. It's a debt of honor my family has owed yours for 16 years. The world had shifted beneath Chloe's feet once again. The story of her life, a narrative of struggle and bad luck, was suddenly part of a much larger, more intricate tapestry of fate and connection. Her father, a hazy figure from her childhood, was suddenly a hero, his legacy echoing through time to save her. Khan's unbelievable offer wasn't the whim of a rich man. It was the closing of a circle, the fulfillment of a promise. She wasn't an imposter. She wasn't a pet project. She was her father's daughter, and the strength he had passed down to her wasn't a liability, but a legacy. The tears that came this time were not of sadness or humiliation, but of a profound, earth-shattering understanding. The fight with Genevieve, with the board, with the whole cynical world, it was no longer just her fight. It was her father's, too, and she would not let him down. Chloe returned to the O'Connell Tower the next morning, but she was not the same woman who had fled the day before. The knowledge of her father's legacy had forged a new spine of steel within her. She walked past her office and directly into a high-level planning meeting for the fundraising gala, a meeting she hadn't been invited to. Genevieve Ashford stopped mid-sentence as Chloe entered. "I believe you're in the wrong room," she said icily. "No, I'm exactly where I need to be," Chloe replied, her voice ringing with newfound authority. She turned to the assembled team. "The Gilded Evening concept is cancelled. It's exploitative and misses the entire point of the foundation. We're not selling pity. We're building bridges." Before Genevieve could protest, Chloe laid out her new vision. The event would be called the Bridge Builders Initiative. Instead of a lavish party, it would be an immersive showcase. She described creating powerful installations, each detailing a real, solvable problem, a family needing car repair, a student needing a laptop. Guests wouldn't just donate, they would use tablets to directly fund a specific need in what she called the market of moments. Genevieve was apoplectic, calling the idea grim, uncomfortable, and doomed to fail. "You can't ask millionaires to feel bad," she argued to Khan. "It's fundraising 101. Khan simply looked at Chloe, saw the fire in her eyes, and overruled Genevieve. "Let her work," he commanded. It was a colossal gamble, and Chloe's future rested on the outcome. The night of the event, the atmosphere was tense. Wealthy donors arrived in bespoke suits and couture gowns, looking confused by the raw industrial space and the stark museum-like exhibits. For a moment, Chloe's stomach churned as they milled about awkwardly. Genevieve stood in a corner, a smug "I told you so" look on her face. Then the first domino fell. An elderly woman draped in diamonds stood before an installation about a veteran who couldn't afford a prosthetic limb. After listening to his story, she quietly tapped her tablet. A large screen on the wall, previously dark, lit up. A hero's mobility funded. A gasp went through the room. A tech mogul then funded a year's worth of specialized baby formula for a low-income family. Another screen lit up. Soon, it became a cascade. The quiet competition wasn't about ego, but about impact. The room transformed from a party into a mission control center for kindness. The night was capped by a raw, heartfelt speech from a local food bank director whose honest words cut through any remaining pretense. By the end of the evening, they hadn't just met their fundraising goal, they had tripled it. More importantly, real connections were made between the city's elite and its frontline community leaders. The next morning, Genevieve Ashford's resignation was on Khan's desk. As Chloe looked out over the city from her office, Khan came to stand beside her. "You didn't just throw a party, Chloe," he said, his voice filled with a respect she had never heard before. "You showed them how to be architects of change. Your father saved one life with his hands. You honored him tonight by showing hundreds of people how to save lives with their hearts." 2 years later, Chloe Bennett was no longer an imposter in a gilded cage. She was its architect. As executive director, she had grown the O'Connell Foundation into a formidable force for good. Its Bridge Builders initiative, a celebrated model of effective philanthropy. She moved through the world with a quiet confidence, her past struggles not a source of shame, but the bedrock of her strength. Her brother Leo, now in remission, was in his first year of medical school. His future was a bright horizon. Her partnership with Khan was one of deep mutual respect, the debt between their families long repaid and replaced by a shared mission. One rainy Tuesday, driving home, an old instinct led her back to the I-95 corridor and the familiar buzzing sign of the Starlight Diner. The place was timeless, steeped in the same scent of fried onions and stale coffee. She took a booth and watched a young waitress, no older than 20, move through the evening rush. In the girl's tired eyes and forced smile, Chloe saw a painful reflection of herself, a ghost from a life that felt a world away. When Chloe paid for her coffee, she left a $500 tip on the small bill. Enough to be a lifeline, but not so much as to be a fantasy. Beneath the amount, she didn't leave a phone number or a promise of rescue. She simply wrote, "I see how hard you're working. Your strength is worth more than you know. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." She left without seeing the waitress's reaction. As Chloe drove away, leaving the diner's light behind, she understood the truth of her journey. Con O'Connell hadn't saved her. He had given her a door and the key. It was her own courage that had turned it. Her own vision that had built the new world on the other side. Her life had been changed forever, not by a billionaire's gift, but by the profound power of being seen, and the realization that her true purpose was to hold that door open for others. The story of Chloe Bennett is a powerful reminder that our true worth isn't measured by We aren't truly defined by our job titles or bank balances, but rather by the quiet, unwavering integrity we demonstrate when no one is looking. This speaks volumes about the profound impact of a single act of kindness, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, actions that can resonate across generations and dramatically alter the trajectory of a life. Chloe wasn't merely rescued from poverty. She was empowered, transformed into a force for good, a savior for others. Her story powerfully illustrates the truth that those who endure the deepest struggles often emerge as the strongest and most compassionate leaders. Her remarkable journey, a transformation from a disheartened waitress to a beacon of hope and inspiration, reveals the existence of individuals like Keon O'Connell, people who perceive value where others see only emptiness. More significantly, it illuminates the countless Chloes in the world, brimming with untapped potential, patiently waiting for their moment to shine, their opportunity to make a difference. If you found this story inspiring and uplifting, please show your appreciation by hitting the like button. Share it with someone who could benefit from a reminder that their character and inherent worth are paramount. And remember to subscribe and enable notifications so you won't miss our next inspiring story about the extraordinary, often unseen, connections that shape the fabric of our world.